His words didn't hit my ears. They hit my chest. You're just a passenger today. Don't forget it. The people around us heard nothing. His cruelty wore a smile. I turned to the window silent because 37 years had taught me that words were his weapons and silence was mine. But minutes later, when the plane screamed and oxygen masks dropped like white ghosts from the ceiling, everything changed. Through the intercom came a voice so quiet it was almost a prayer. I need Spectre from row 9. Now. My call sign. A name no one here should know. I watched my brother's face drain of colour, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear replace his arrogance. 3 weeks after my father died, I found myself on a plane from Amsterdam to New York. The funeral was waiting. So was the fight over everything he left behind. My brother Mason sat beside me in the aisle seat. He didn't ask. He never asked. That's who Mason was. He took what he wanted and expected the world to adjust. When I buckled my seatbelt and stared out at the tarmac, he leaned closer. His voice was low, casual, like he was sharing the weather. Don't get any ideas about the will. You're not equipped to handle what Dad left us. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence frustrated him more than any argument ever could. Mason never forgave me for choosing the military. To him, my decision to join the Air Force wasn't courage. It was rebellion. A rejection of the life he had mapped out for both of us. Over the years, he refined his contempt into an art form. Playing soldier, he called it. Running away from real responsibility. But today, something was different. His tone carried an edge I hadn't heard before. He leaned even closer, his breath warm against my ear. You know about that report, don't you? The psychological evaluation. The one that said you crack under pressure. I read it, Vivian. Everyone has. The air left my lungs. That report, years ago, after a NATO training rotation, I sat across from an evaluator who asked me calm, clinical questions. How do you handle stress? What happens when systems fail? I answered every question with precision, but something in my answers made him pause. Weeks later, the report arrived. Buried in 12 pages of competency assessments was a single sentence. Potentially unstable under sustained non-kinetic pressure. 7 words that rewrote my career. Advancement stopped. Command positions vanished. Rooms that once opened with a salute now required permission to enter. I flew harder, trained longer, spoke less. The stain never lifted. Then it leaked. Not through carelessness. Not through bureaucratic error. My own brother forwarded it to a family attorney with a cover note that read like a verdict. Vivian lacks the mental stability for fiduciary responsibility or leadership roles. He was building a legal fortress around our father's estate long before the old man took his last breath. He thought I'd never find out. But pilots survive by keeping records. I found the email chain. I noted the dates. I documented every lie. Not for revenge, for truth. Because truth, when recorded with precision, doesn't need to raise its voice. So I stayed silent on that plane. I pulled out the small black notebook I always carried and wrote down his exact words. The time. The context. Mason smirked, satisfied with my silence, and settled back into his seat. He thought he'd won. He had no idea the plane was about to teach both of us what winning actually looked like. We were somewhere over the Atlantic, suspended between continents when I felt it. A vibration that didn't belong. Pilots know the difference between turbulence and trouble, the way mothers know the difference between a cry and a scream. This was trouble. The right engine didn't fail. It exploded. The sound tore through the cabin like metal being ripped apart by invisible hands. The plane lurched. Overhead bins shook. A chemical smell, sharp and bitter, filled the air. Then the oxygen masks dropped, all at once. 100 white masks falling like surrender flags. Passengers screamed. A child wailed. Mason cursed and grabbed my arm so hard I felt his nails bite into my skin. His face, always so composed, so controlled, went pale as paper. Alarms erupted across the cabin. The automated voice, calm and robotic, told everyone to fasten their seatbelts and remain calm. But the plane wasn't listening to automation anymore. It tilted, hard. I felt the pitch angles shift in ways that had nothing to do with weather. My hands moved without thought, gripping the armrest, my mind already sorting variables. Altitude, airspeed, engine status. How much time do we have? Then I heard it. Through the chaos, through the screaming and the alarms, a voice crackled over the intercom. It wasn't meant for passengers. It was barely a whisper coded for someone who understood. Get me Spectre from row 9. Now. I froze. That name, my call sign. earned in operations that were never written down, in places that didn't exist on any map. No one here should know it. I turned toward the cockpit. One of the flight attendants was already scanning the rows. Panic bright in her eyes. Mason's grip tightened on my wrist. His voice shook. Sit down. Don't make this worse. You're not flying this plane. You're nobody here. I looked at him, really looked at him. And I saw what I'd always known but never named. He was terrified. Not of the plane. Of me. Of what I could do that he never could. Not today, Mason, I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood. The aisle rolled beneath my feet like a ship's deck, but I kept my balance. Passengers stared, some with confusion, some with hope they didn't dare name. As I reached the cockpit, the head flight attendant stepped in front of me. Her hands trembled. "Are you Spectre?" she whispered. I nodded once. She hesitated just a heartbeat, then opened the door. The cockpit was drowning. Not in water. In light. Red lights. Yellow lights. Lights flashing in patterns that screamed emergency in a language most people would never learn. The air smelled like overheating circuits and fear. The captain looked up at me. He was tall, sharp-featured, Dutch, and sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the cold air. "You're Spectre?" he asked. His voice was tight but steady. The voice of a man who hadn't given up yet. "Vivian Hayes," I said, stepping inside. "United States Air Force. Combat pilot. I can help." He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for credentials or question my authority. He simply nodded and pointed to the co-pilot's seat. The first officer was slumped against the side wall, semi-conscious. An oxygen mask strapped over his face. His hands twitched uselessly. The captain spoke quickly in Dutch. Too fast for the flight attendants to follow. But I understood. I answered in the same language, my voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision. I requested emergency coordinates through a classified relay channel to Amsterdam Operations Control. I spoke 3 phrases, authentication codes I'd memorized years ago during my NATO rotations. Codes that opened a direct line to controllers who monitored the North Atlantic airspace when everything else failed. The captain's eyes widened as the navigation screen, which had been flickering and blank, suddenly filled with stable data. Flight path, wind vectors, alternate landing sites. "How did you—" he started. I raised my hand. "Fly the airplane, Captain. I'll handle communications." I slid into the co-pilot's seat and wrapped my fingers around the secondary controls. The yoke felt warm, alive, like shaking hands with an old friend who was dying. Through the open cockpit door, I could see Mason. He was standing in the aisle, gripping a seat back to keep from falling. His face was frozen in disbelief. The brother who had just called me nobody was watching me take control of 200 lives. He didn't say a word. For once in his life, Mason had nothing to say. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to tell you how I got here. Not just to this cockpit, but to this moment where my father's death, my brother's betrayal, and the weight of 200 strangers collided 30,000 feet above the ocean. I had just finished a rotation with NATO, months moving between air bases in Germany, Italy, and places I'm still not allowed to name. Amsterdam was supposed to be a pause, a quiet space to pack my uniforms, sign my discharge papers, and remember what it felt like to walk down a street without scanning for threats. I thought I was done with the sky. I was wrong. Mason had been living in Amsterdam for years, practicing corporate law, building a life that looked successful from the outside. When he talked to me, he made it clear that my career was a phase, a detour, something I'd eventually outgrow when I realized what real success looked like. When our father died, the will forced us back into the same space. And like 2 planes on a collision course, it wasn't about speed. It was about trajectory. Mason had a plan for the estate. I had a duty to the truth. Those 2 things don't share the same sky. My decision to step back from active duty looked like burnout to most people. Exhaustion. But the truth was simpler and uglier. Years earlier, a psychological evaluation flagged me after a routine training exercise. 1 sentence buried in a sea of competency marks. Potentially unstable under sustained non-kinetic pressure. Careful language. Brutal meaning. My career stalled. Doors closed. I worked harder. Flew better. Spoke less. The flag stayed. Then the report leaked. Not through an accident. Through my brother. He forwarded it to a family attorney with a note that framed me as unfit for responsibility, leadership, or trust. He was building a case against me long before our father's body was cold. He didn't think I'd find out. But I did, because I log everything. Pilots who survive learn that documentation is survival. So I stayed silent. I gathered evidence. I waited. When Mason and I boarded that flight to New York, he thought he'd already won. He thought his words could keep me in my place. "You're just a passenger," he said. And he believed it. But roles aren't permanent. They're tested. And when that engine exploded, when those masks dropped, when that voice called for Spectre, the only thing that mattered was who could bring 200 people home alive. Mason's law degree couldn't do that. His confidence couldn't do that. But I could. Our father built his fortune quietly. Real estate, investments that grew while Mason and I were too young to understand money. By the time he died, there were properties, portfolios, and trusts that could shape our futures. Mason saw those assets as a crown, and he was already wearing it. He wanted total control. The morning before our flight, we met for coffee. He spread legal documents across the table like a general planning a siege. He talked about probate, tax strategies, executive authority. When I asked about transparency, he laughed. Not a friendly laugh, a dismissive one. "You're a soldier, Vivian. This is law. This is finance. Not whatever you think flying a plane taught you." He didn't understand. Flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft through hostile airspace requires more precision, more discipline, more decision-making than any boardroom I've ever seen. But I let him talk. Silence unnerves people who need control. The will was straightforward. Split the assets between us. Charitable donations in our father's name. But Mason kept hinting that he'd challenge it. He'd argue I wasn't stable enough to handle responsibility. The same poison he'd been spreading for years. Every time he spoke, I wrote it down. In my small black notebook. The one I'd carried through every mission. Altitude. Fuel. Radio calls. Now I logged Mason's insults. Exact words. Exact times. Not for revenge. For evidence. Because if you want to dismantle a lie, you start with facts. At the airport gate, he signed documents on his tablet without looking at me. "When we land," he said, "I'm meeting with the attorney. Don't expect to be involved in any real decisions. You're not trained for this." That's when I knew. He truly believed words were power. He believed control came from contracts and arguments. He didn't understand that real control comes from staying calm when everything fails. As we boarded, I tucked my notebook into my bag. Every word he'd said was recorded. Mason thought he was winning. He had no idea what was about to happen. The turbulence started subtle, just a tremor. Then it grew. The plane began to shake in a rhythm that felt wrong, asymmetric, like something was loose that shouldn't be. The digital systems started failing. Messages appeared and vanished on the screens. The radio filled with static. The captain tried to correct, adjusting trim, fighting the controls with the kind of gentle precision that takes decades to learn. But the pitch kept oscillating. Shallow, then steep. Shallow again, then steeper. A warning tone vibrated through the control column. Not a full stall yet, but close enough that instinct woke up before thought could catch up. The workload in the cockpit exploded. The captain was managing radios, checklists, engine parameters, cabin updates. His hands moved everywhere, which meant they couldn't stay anywhere long enough. The first officer slumped deeper into his oxygen mask. His eyes were open but empty. His hands made small. Useless movements at switches that no longer controlled anything. I scanned the instruments. The primary flight display flickered. The horizon line stuttered. Numbers appeared, disappeared, reappeared 2 degrees off. I didn't need perfect data. The airplane was telling me everything I needed to know through vibration, through smell, through the rising pitch of alarms. The captain called for a descent. Controlled. Shallow. But the sink rate spiked anyway. Gravity stopped negotiating. Vertical speed bled away, then surged. The autopilot had already given up, its light blinking like a shrug. I scanned for trends, not precision. Heading drift. Wind shear. Thrust numbers that didn't match our descent rate. The communications systems refused our requests. Messages came through half-finished, like someone trying to speak underwater. The captain looked at me. The way pilots look at each other when pride becomes irrelevant. "Take the secondary controls," he said. My hand closed around the yoke. My thumb found the trim switch. My eyes locked onto the wavering horizon line. Memory took over. Angles. Pressure. The patience to wait 1 second longer before correcting. Because overcorrecting kills faster than undercorrecting. The stall warning chirped again. Shorter this time. The nose wanted to wander. I let it drift, then coaxed it back like calming a panicked animal. Behind the cockpit door, passengers were praying, crying, bargaining with God. I heard it like background weather. Mason's face appeared in my peripheral vision. Disbelief. Terror. Pride collapsing into dust. I ignored him. Pride doesn't hold altitude. Physics does. We were between continents, between authorities, between options. The only law that mattered now was physics, and physics is fair to everyone. I asked for weight and balance data. Winds aloft. The captain read what he had. I filled in the rest, building a mental map of the invisible path we needed to follow. The airplane sagged. I traded altitude for stability. Time for control. Because survival is a currency you spend carefully. The captain's breathing accelerated. His voice cracked on the checklist. I spoke slower, shorter, cutting his workload in half with every word. Outside, clouds turned to charcoal. Inside, our world shrank to numbers and will. I knew we had minutes, not hours. One decision, maybe 2 corrections. Everything else was theatre. And theatre kills at altitude. The captain's hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from exhaustion. From wrestling with machinery that no longer obeyed. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a question he didn't want to ask. Spectre, he said. Just the call sign. Not a question. A plea. I slid fully into the right seat. The first officer was still slumped, breathing but useless. The captain nodded toward the controls. Standard frequencies are dead, he said. We're not getting clear data from anyone. Do you have another way? I had one. And I hated that I knew it by heart. During my NATO rotation, I'd been granted access to a classified relay channel through Amsterdam's operations control. A line that cut through static when civilian systems failed. It required military clearance, voice authentication, codes layered on codes. The captain didn't have access. I did. I reached for the encrypted panel hidden under a protective cover. The one most commercial pilots never touch in their entire careers. My thumb hovered. Then I pressed the switch and spoke in Dutch. Clear, unwavering. The first of 3 authentication phrases. Identification. Request for emergency coordinates. Silence. Then static. Then a voice answering in Dutch confirming my clearance. I gave the second phrase. Then the third. Call sign. Mission codes. One-time authentication keys I'd memorized and prayed I'd never need. It felt like putting on a uniform I'd folded away forever. Carrying the weight of an oath I thought I'd laid down. Operations control took less than 30 seconds. They triangulated our position, verified our flight path, pushed real-time data to the controllers monitoring the North Atlantic corridor. The captain stared as the navigation screen filled with information. Weather, winds, alternate landing sites. How he started. I cut him off. Fly the airplane. I'll handle everything else. The next transmission hit like a fist. The remaining engine was overheating. Oil pressure dropping. It might seize completely. The words were technical. The meaning was simple. Prepare to glide. If the engine quit, we'd fly on borrowed altitude until we found ground. If we could find ground. The captain swallowed hard. I saw him calculating. Weight. Glide ratio. Wind. I was already ahead of him, running profiles I'd drilled in training sessions that simulated the impossible. I'll keep them updated, I said. My voice was calm, but my heart was pounding a combat rhythm. You fly the pitch. Keep us level. We need every foot of altitude we have. I relayed our status. Altitude. Sink rate. Fuel. Operations control fed back wind vectors, turbulence zones, cloud density. Data that normally takes minutes to decode. We didn't have minutes. I translated on the fly, adjusting our path in my head. Outside, the Atlantic stretched dark and endless. No land, just grey water and white foam like teeth waiting. I felt Mason's stare from the cabin. Heavy, disbelieving. The sister he called nobody was speaking languages he'd never understand. He didn't need to understand. 200 lives did. As I finished the third authentication phrase, the cockpit went quiet for one breath. The possibility of losing the last engine wasn't theoretical anymore. It was the plan we had to make. I looked at the captain. If we go silent, I take the glide. Get ready to dump fuel. He nodded, trusting me, trusting Spectre. The captain and I split the work like surgeons on a dying patient. I spoke to operations control. He flew. Then the roles flipped. He looked at me, jaw tight. I've never flown a full glide with this many souls on board. I didn't hesitate. Then I will. We traded places without ceremony. His hands left the yoke. Mine took it. The trim switch felt hot under my thumb. He took the radios. His voice steadied now that he had one clear task. Mine went cold. I trimmed out words until only data remained. Pitch down 2.5 degrees. Bank 3 degrees right. Sink rate 800 feet per minute. Confirm. The airplane shuddered. I listened. Let it speak. Control came in waves. Confidence, then doubt, then confidence again. Each correction taught me the next. When you fly in crisis, you don't chase perfection. You chase the trend line that keeps everyone breathing. The captain relayed my numbers to the controllers. For the first time since the explosion, we felt like one mind instead of two people drowning separately. Operations Control updated our weight estimate. I ordered a fuel dump. The captain hesitated. Legal concerns. I reminded him quietly that legality doesn't matter if you arrive in pieces. He authorized it. The plane lightened. Our glide ratio improved. Margins. That's what survival is made of. A new vibration rattled the rudder pedals. Response lagged, then jerked. I adjusted in tiny increments, coaxing the tail back into line like calming a frightened horse. Small pressure. Time. Repetition. You're flying by feel, the captain said. Not accusing. Reverent. There's nothing left to trust, I said, except air and time. I narrowed my scan. Attitude. Airspeed. Vertical speed. The horizon wavering through haze. Everything else was noise. He called out storm cells ahead. I altered course 2 degrees, stealing calmer air, knowing I'd pay for it later with a steeper approach. He didn't argue. Trust is earned in freefall. Over the intercom, the captain spoke to the cabin. He told them we had additional support in the cockpit. He didn't say my name. Names don't slow sync rates. Action does. Mason's silence pressed against the door like a physical weight. He'd run out of words. Fear has no vocabulary. The oscillations narrowed. Control returned, not as victory, as agreement between gravity and discipline. The airplane settled into the glide I wanted. A wounded bird following me home. You have it, the captain said. I have it, I answered. Responsibility, not pride. Then the final data packet arrived. Every number confirmed what we'd feared. The engine was about to quit. When it did, we'd trade everything we had left for one chance at concrete. One approach, one landing. Because one chance flown well is enough. The moment arrived without drama. A shudder rippled through the airframe. Deep. Final. The engine coughed twice and went silent. Not a gradual failure. Just silence. The absence of thrust roared louder than any alarm ever could. We shifted from powered flight to pure glide. 170 tons of aluminum skating on air. I tightened my grip. Engine 2 is gone, I said. My voice didn't shake. The captain confirmed, scanning dead gauges, flipping switches that no longer mattered. Hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. Every control surface was now manual. Force and feel instead of automation. I called for flaps. Nothing responded. The indicator blinked red. Flaps non-responsive, I said. We fly clean. I'll need to feel every change. The captain nodded. He understood. He monitored altitude and wind while I did what no passenger should ever witness. I flew by touch. Not instruments. Not automation. By the living pulse of metal under my hands. The nose dropped too fast. I eased back. Too much pressure and we'd bleed speed. Too little and we'd sink too steep to recover. Every second was negotiation between lift and gravity. There was a moment, 4 seconds, maybe less, when my mind went blank. I won't lie about it. Not anymore. As I felt the controls resist, as I realized I was alone with this machine and these lives, a thought flashed. If I fail, no one will ever know why. The old evaluation echoed, unstable under pressure. For 4 seconds I believed it. Then I buried that voice under years of training and pure will. I pulled. I corrected. I flew. Operations Control came back with a final assessment. Prepare for glide landing. We were too far from any major airport. But there was an emergency strip on an old map. A Cold War relic barely within our envelope. One chance. I adjusted trim manually. Every input felt like moving a steel door against wind. The captain's hand hovered near mine, ready to take over if I faltered. But I didn't falter. Vivian, he said quietly. You have the controls. I have them, I said. And I meant it. Not just the yoke. The weight. The responsibility. All of it. Dead engine silence at altitude feels like holding your breath underwater. I asked the captain to stabilize while I went full data mode. I need winds aloft. temperature deviation, turbulence vectors, everything you have. My voice stayed calm while my mind ran calculations like solving an equation written in lives. Operations control responded with precision. Controllers confirmed minimum sync rate. 3.2 degrees nose down. 240 knots airspeed. Thin margins. But workable. I trimmed manually, feeling resistance in the tail. Every input mattered. Too much nose up, we stall. Too much down, we overspeed into structural failure. I calculated weight distribution, fuel dump results, temperatures at potential landing zones. We need the optimal glide slope, I said. The captain's eyes locked on the horizon. Then let's find the thread. We were high over the Atlantic, but not high enough. Every foot of altitude was currency, and our account was almost empty. Operations Control pushed coordinates for an abandoned airstrip. Cold War emergency site. Barely in range. A speck on the edge of our glide path. Better than ocean. One shot, I told the captain. Miss and we're out of options. Then the flight attendant's voice broke through. Passenger in cardiac arrest. Seat 14. No pulse. We're doing compressions. Panic rippled through the cabin behind us. Crying. Praying. Someone calling for a doctor. I set my jaw. Tell them to continue compressions. We'll be on the ground before the clock runs out. The captain glanced at me, surprised by my certainty. I wasn't promising. I was committing. We touch down before medical time expires, I repeated, loud enough for the interphone to carry to the cabin. The crying quieted. That kind of silence that chooses to believe. I fine-tuned angle of attack, feeling airflow tremors through the fuselage. Training said trust the numbers. Instinct said trust the feel. I needed both. Vertical speed settled at minus 800 feet per minute. Steady. Relentless. This profile gives us 26 minutes. We used 20 to reach that strip. Mason's face flashed in my mind. His arrogance. His contempt. Now silent behind the cockpit door, realizing the nobody he dismissed was calculating his survival to the last foot. I let that fuel clarity, not anger. I called Operations Control. Confirmed heading. Wind shear data. Emergency vehicles. They acknowledged. My voice never wavered. One chance, I whispered. I won't waste it. The airstrip was a scar in wilderness. Cracked concrete surrounded by forest. Emergency trucks lined the edges, lights flashing like distant fireflies. I gripped the yoke with both hands. Palms slick. Mind ice cold. Operations confirmed landing gear deployment. Status indicators flickered. Gear might not be locked, the captain said. We'll know on impact. I made the call fast. Touch nose first. Force mechanical lock on the mains. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But he didn't argue. One shot means full commitment. The aircraft trembled as I adjusted pitch. Angle of attack razor-thin between glide and stall. I ran the final checklist out loud. Speed 230. Altitude 2000. Flaps non-functional. Manual brakes armed. My left hand hovered over the emergency brake lever. I checked the nose gear camera. Static. Toggled again. Blurry black and white. No clarity. Blind on the gear, I muttered. The captain's lips pressed thin. Then we land anyway, I said. Treetops rushed up beneath us. Dark. Sharp. Waiting. I eased the nose down, aligning with the faded center line. My breathing slowed. Every hour in simulators. Every combat landing. All of it led here. Wind whined. Loose panels clattered. Brace, I said into the intercom. My voice cut clear and final through the cabin. I pictured Mason somewhere back there. Pale. Gripping his armrest. For once, I didn't care what he thought. If I did this right, he'd have no words left anyway. The ground rose like a wall. I pushed the nose down deliberately. Harder than protocol. Using momentum to slam the mains into lock. A metallic thunk shook the fuselage. Lock or break? I didn't wait to find out. I leveled. Front wheels hit first. Teeth rattled. Main gear slammed down. Rubber screamed on concrete. Sparks fountained from the left side. Burnt rubber and hot metal flooded the cockpit. Manual brakes, I said, yanking the lever. The aircraft shook violently. We skidded. Bounced. A rear tire shredded. Smoke poured past windows, blurring the runway's thin line. The captain called distances. 500 feet. 300. Voice strained but clear. I held steady, adjusting only enough to stay centered. Forest edges blurred with trees. Dark. Waiting. Passengers screamed behind us. Someone prayed out loud. My heart hammered, but my hands never trembled. This wasn't landing anymore. This was will fighting momentum. Brakes shrieked. Smoke thickened. Forest raced closer. I leaned into the yoke as if my weight alone could stop us. Every second stretched. 40 feet, the captain shouted. Trees right there. An approaching wall. I gave one last brutal pull on the brakes. The aircraft lurched. Metal groaned protest. We skidded sideways for one breathless instant, then stopped, 40 feet from the trees. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the cabin erupted. Sobs. Cheers. Laughter breaking like waves. I sat frozen, hands still locked on the yoke. The smell of burning rubber searing into memory. We were alive. Applause thundered through the cabin. Relief crashing over the silence that had held us for an hour. People crying, hugging, whispering thank yous into cold air that still smelled of smoke and survival. I heard the clapping, but didn't feel it. I sat motionless, fingers gripping the yoke like it was the only thing tethering me to this world. 4 seconds. That's the truth I hadn't told anyone. Not the captain. Not operations control. Right before touchdown, I froze. Not from doubt about the landing. Not from fear of death. An old memory slammed into me like turbulence. The day they labeled me. Unstable under pressure. Years ago. After a NATO exercise. The evaluator asked what I'd do in high-stress emergencies. I answered correctly. Clinically. But his eyes said he didn't believe me. He wrote his report. It followed me like a shadow. And in those 4 seconds on final approach, it came back. A voice whispering I wasn't meant to command in chaos. I don't know if anyone noticed. The captain might have seen my eyes glaze. But I snapped back before my hands betrayed me. 4 seconds felt like 4 hours. Then instinct seized control. I pulled. I braked. We survived. But I know those 4 seconds will live in my mind longer than any applause. Passengers still cheering, I reached for my small black notebook. The log I always carry, where I write every critical moment, every choice, every variable that could be examined later. I flipped it open, wrote with a steady hand. 4 seconds. Next time, 0. The captain leaned close, voice quiet amid chaos. They're calling you a hero. I shook my head, eyes still on the page. Heroes don't freeze, I murmured. He didn't respond. But his silence carried respect I hadn't expected. Flight attendants opened the cabin door. Cold evening air rushed in with flashing emergency lights. Paramedics waited with stretchers. Many passengers walked off under their own strength. Some paused to bow their heads as they passed the cockpit. I stayed seated. I wasn't ready to face them. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mason standing in the aisle. He didn't speak, didn't sneer. His face was pale and wet with tears or sweat. For the first time in years, he looked at me not as his sister, not as a rival, but as someone he couldn't comprehend. I offered no words. Silence once again my weapon. Then came the first shout from beyond the emergency cordon. A reporter. Who landed that plane? I ignored it, but I knew the answer was already out. Someone had told them my call sign. It was only time before Spectre turned from nickname to headline. Later that night, escorted to temporary shelter for debriefing, I overheard the captain on the phone with aviation authorities. Words like unprecedented and procedural review floated. I knew what came next. Investigations, interviews, lawyers. They'd tear apart every decision, every input, every hesitation. While the world called me hero, authorities were preparing questions. And when they asked, I'd have to decide. Admit the truth about those 4 seconds, or let them believe I was flawless. For now, I kept it in my logbook, written in ink that won't fade. 4 seconds. Next time, 0. News hit within 12 hours. Headlines screamed about a passenger-turned-pilot who saved 200 lives. But narratives split. Some praised my training and quick thinking. Others questioned whether I'd overstepped authority by taking controls. A national broadcast aired heavily edited cockpit recordings, framing it like I'd seized command from a reluctant captain. The anchor's voice dripped judgment. Heroic act or reckless interference? I didn't watch the full report, but snippets flooded my phone. Friends from NATO days sent messages ranging from pride to disbelief. I ignored them all. Silence had always been my shield. I wouldn't break it now. But as the media storm built, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The same pressure from investigations years ago. Not fear. Recognition. People love rewriting truth when they don't have all the data. The knife came when an online tabloid published my old psychological evaluation. There it was. Black and white. Potentially unstable under sustained pressure. Ripped from context. Plastered across headlines. Within hours. It became ammunition for commentators questioning why someone with a questionable mental profile had been allowed to intervene in a critical emergency. I didn't need to ask how the report surfaced. The trail was obvious. Years ago, Mason forwarded those documents to his attorney, part of his plan to exclude me from our father's will. Now somehow that same document mysteriously leaked to press. Mason didn't admit it, but I saw it in his eyes when we met after the news broke. Nervous, fidgeting, confidence cracked. You didn't think they'd trace it back to you, did you? I asked quietly. Without anger. He said nothing. Silence louder than any confession. The airline's PR scrambled to manage narrative, while aviation officials prepared formal inquiry. Lawyers circled from every angle, eager to attach liability or credit. Meanwhile, I chose stillness. No interviews, no social media statements. I let noise swirl around me like crosswinds. My attorney, sharp woman with sharper mind, stepped in. "We'll handle this," she said. She filed legal motion demanding investigation into leak of my personal records. Defamation. Breach of privacy. Her strategy was surgical. Let evidence speak. Let truth emerge without emotional outbursts. In private, I opened my logbook, wrote one line. Media storms are just turbulence. Steady hands, steady mind. My reminder that survival doesn't end with landing. Sometimes the real battle begins after. Mason avoided me for days, but I knew he felt the weight of what he'd done. Truth no longer hidden. While I didn't seek revenge in loud ways, I understood that truth, documented, precise, undeniable, was the sharpest weapon. The hearings were nothing like cabin roar or cockpit chaos. Colder. Sterile. Room lined with polished wood, microphones, faces hiding judgment behind practiced neutrality. I walked in wearing simple suit, my logbook tucked under my arm, a weapon that didn't need to shout to be sharp. Investigators started with black boxes. Data and voice recorder extractions played on screen. Every alarm, every call-out, every sound from those final minutes replayed for the panel. I watched my own voice emerge from speakers. Calm, clipped, calling out pitch angles and glide ratios. Then the moment of truth. The captain's voice, strained but unmistakable. "Get me Spectre. I need her now." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Some who came ready to doubt leaned forward. Realizing I hadn't seized control or played hero, I'd been called forward because there was no other choice. I stood, opened my logbook, every detail recorded. Exact time first engine failed, altitude loss per minute, sync rate trends, vectors calculated from operations control relays, adjustments for winds aloft and temperature deviations. I laid out flight profile with precision, every second, every degree, every nautical mile accounted for, my voice even. Tone analytical, I didn't need emotion. Data spoke louder than any story. One veteran pilot on the board, man with decades of commercial experience, leaned back, narrowed eyes. "Miss Hayes," he said, tone blending curiosity and challenge. "Do you understand how many lives you put at risk by taking controls of a commercial jet without current certification?" I looked directly at him, unflinching. "Yes," I replied. 200, including my own. That is exactly why I didn't stay silent. Room fell quiet. I let the moment hang. Not for drama. To make sure every word landed where it needed. The captain asked me to assist. Autopilot had failed. We were 30 minutes from land with one dying engine. Waiting for external guidance wasn't an option. It wasn't about being reckless. It was about acting before the window closed. I walked them through decision-making step by step. Why I chose glide profile instead of controlled ditching. How I balanced speed against altitude. Why the Cold War Strip was our only viable landing point. Every figure I gave supported by voice-recorded timestamps and data graphs on screen. When I finished, the chairwoman looked at me with something close to respect. "Thank you, Miss Hayes," she said. No applause. No warmth, but enough. As I left the room, I caught sight of Mason in back row, face pale. He wasn't part of hearing, but he was there. Watching narrative he'd tried to twist unravel in front of him. I didn't acknowledge him. I simply closed my logbook and walked out. Data had already spoken. Storm with aviation authorities barely settled when legal battle over our father's estate resumed. Mason had been preparing for months, thinking he could paint me as unstable and unfit to handle family assets. But narrative he tried to create fell apart once truth about landing and his role in leaking my psychological report began to surface. Revelation came during probate court session in New York. My attorney presented email evidence showing Mason's deliberate attempts to discredit me. Forwarded evaluation report, correspondence with his legal team. For first time in years, Mason's confidence cracked in public view. Usual smug expression replaced with something I'd never seen. Shame. Then Mason stood, cleared his throat, addressed the judge. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, wavered. "I need to make something clear," he began. He admitted in front of everyone that he'd intentionally leaked my psychological file, not because he believed I was unfit, but because he couldn't handle living in my shadow. "She was always the brave one," he said. Voice catching. "She became the soldier I could never be, and I hated her for it. I let jealousy guide me." Courtroom went silent. I stared at him, not with anger, with deep, weary understanding. Mason turned toward me, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Vivian, for all of it. For the things I said, the things I tried to take from you." I let his words hang in air. Didn't move. Finally, I said, "Forgiveness isn't a gift I give you. It's a moral obligation I give myself, to stop carrying the weight of what you did. I don't hate you, Mason, but I won't let what you did define me." Judge ruled in my favor. Portion of estate Mason tried to control restored to me, exactly as our father's will intended. No celebration, no sense of victory. Just quiet realization that justice, when done properly, is rarely loud. Outside courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Microphones waved. I stayed composed. Mason stepped beside me. Posture deflated but genuine. "You deserved better from me," he said quietly. "I can't change what I did, but I can start making it right." I didn't answer directly. Simply said, "The best way to make it right is to stop fighting the wrong battles." Then I walked away. Logbook tucked under my arm as always. Reminder of what truly matters. Facts, actions, and courage to face both. That night, I wrote one final line about Mason. Redemption comes slowly, but at least it starts with truth. Colonel Marcus Shaw found me 3 weeks after hearings. We met at Quiet Training Center in upstate New York. Place that smelled of hydraulic fluid, jet fuel, and crisp autumn air. He looked same as I remembered. Squared shoulders. Calm gaze. The kind of presence that made even silent rooms feel commanded. "Vivian," he said, shaking my hand with firm grip. "We've been watching everything. Your landing. The hearings. How you handled the fallout. I came to offer what you've earned back. Full reinstatement. Full command track if you want it." Words landed like weight in my chest. I'd once wanted that more than anything. Uniform. Authority. Skies under insignia of mission bigger than myself. But I'd also spent years proving I could survive without it. "I appreciate it," I said, voice steady. "But I'm not going back. Not the way I used to." He tilted his head, expecting this answer but still curious. "Then what do you want?" "I want to teach what happens when things fall apart," I said. "Not just procedures. Mindset. Mental survival tactics when every alarm screams and ground is too close. I want to train them for moments no manual covers." Shaw smiled slightly. "Special emergency instructor," he mused. "Not a title we've used before. But I suppose for Spectre we can make room." It became official within days. My role wasn't about combat sorties or medals. I was assigned to Joint Emergency Response Program, working with military and civilian pilots. My focus singular. How to stay calm when aircraft is no longer machine but falling question. First time I stepped into simulator as instructor, I felt familiar hum in my bones. Watched group of young pilots strapped into mock cockpit. Hands eager but untested. We ran scenarios. Engine failures. Electrical fires. Full hydraulic losses. Some performed with mechanical precision. Others cracked under unseen pressure. One day, bright but nervous lieutenant hit critical failure sequence and froze. 6 seconds. Long enough to lose altitude. Long enough for panic to write its own outcome. I stood behind him, arms crossed, waiting until silence was too loud to ignore. Then I leaned in. "Do you know what it's like to freeze?" I asked. He swallowed, nodded slightly. "I do," I said, voice low but unshaken. 4 seconds. That's how long I froze before I landed that jet. 4 seconds where my mind went blank. I'm not proud of it, but I own it. You can't train fear out of yourself, but you can train what comes after. Room was silent, every eye on me. I told them about the moment, static in my head. Sudden memory of psychological report that once tried to define me. How I clawed my way back to action. Those seconds don't define you unless you let them. You break their grip by moving anyway. Lieutenant blinked, exhaled, reset his controls. I saw something shift in him. Same shift I'd once forced on myself. Realization that courage isn't about never freezing, but about thawing faster than fear can take hold. That day, I wrote another line in logbook. Teach them 0 seconds. Months later, I recognized him before he spoke. Jacob, seat 23. The boy who'd stared at me through cockpit door while I wrestled glider from sky. He was older now, just enough to carry quiet confidence in how he walked. He found me after training session, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Miss Hayes," he said, voice respectful but earnest. "I want to learn. Not just flying. I want to learn how you did what you did, how you stayed calm when no one else could." I studied him for a moment, something raw and unpolished in him. But also that rare fire you can't teach. Training isn't easy, I said. It's not about thrill. It's about precision under pressure. Being willing to fail 100 times in silence. "I'm ready," he said simply. Jacob began with basics, moving from ground school to simulator, always pushing harder than anyone expected. Stubborn. But in right way. I saw him taking notes in battered notebook, much like my own logbook. When I asked why he was so persistent, he said, "Because I saw what it looks like when someone refuses to quit. I can't unsee that." One day, during high-stakes emergency simulation for advanced trainees, one of senior instructors, veteran pilot with decades of experience, collapsed mid-session, sudden drop in blood sugar. Panic rippled through room as simulation kept running. Jacob didn't hesitate, slid into seat, hands on controls, eyes scanning failing instruments. "Dead stick scenario," I called out, testing him. "You have no engines. Altitude dropping fast. What's your move?" Jacob's response was sharp. Voice steady. He outlined glide profile. Cross-checked Windeloft data. Stabilized simulator as if he'd been born in cockpit. When emergency crew helped instructor recover, entire room was silent. I felt surge of something I rarely allowed. Pride. Not in myself, but in proof that legacy isn't about medals or headlines. It's about passing skill of staying calm when everything burns. At final evaluation, I signed his recommendation for full scholarship. But I made one condition. Scholarship would bear our father's name. Not mine, because this is about more than me. I told Mason, who'd quietly attended ceremony. This is about building something that outlives the fights we thought mattered. Mason stood at back of room, hands in pockets, watching Jacob accept scholarship. For first time I saw in his face flicker of understanding. Weight of pressure. Meaning of control when lives hang on every decision. Later that night, I closed logbook with final entry. Teach them to rise higher than fear. And let the name Hayes stand for more than survival. It should stand for those who refuse to let fear win. Jacob left with his wings that day, but I knew he'd return. Not to thank me, but to teach someone else what it means to hold steady when world shakes. And that, more than any landing I ever made, felt like true victory. Reunion flight took place on crisp spring afternoon in New York. Airline reserved quiet hangar. One by one, passengers of that day walked in. Some carried flowers. Others simply carried weight of memories they couldn't quite put into words. There was table with photographs of landing site. Smoke rising from wheels. Fire trucks circling. Faces stunned but alive. I stood off to side, listening as survivors shared what they remembered. Mother recalled clutching her child, whispering prayers. Convinced she'd never see another sunrise. Elderly man recounted metallic screech of wheels hitting cracked runway. How he thought, this is it. This is how it ends. They told these stories not as accusations but as confessions of fear and gratitude. I didn't speak for a long time. Didn't stand there as hero. Stood as someone who understood cost of survival. Moments of silence afterward. Waytime itself feels heavier when you know you've borrowed it. When I finally did speak, voice was steady but soft. "I wasn't just a passenger," I said, glancing at faces looking back at me. But I wasn't alone either. None of us made it through that day alone. There was quiet hum of agreement, kind of understanding that only comes from those who've shared same breathless moment between life and death. Mason was there too, seated in back, posture no longer rigid with pride. After gathering, he approached me, carrying simple white envelope. Didn't say much, just placed it on table between us. Inside was signed document, formal statement relinquishing any claim over our father's disputed assets. More than that, Mason had pledged half of what he'd secured to fund emergency response scholarship through training foundation I'd started. "It's time I contributed to something bigger than my grudges," he said quietly. I looked at him, reading sincerity in his face. "No need for hugs or dramatics." I simply nodded. "I don't forgive you because of this," I told him. Tone firm but not unkind. "I forgive you because it's the only way I can move forward without carrying both of our mistakes." He nodded, accepting truth without argument. That night, I opened logbook. On first blank page wrote 4 seconds. "Remember, no one is perfect, but anyone can learn to hold steady." It wasn't note about past anymore. It was reminder for every student, every pilot, every person who might one day face their own moment of stillness before action. Later, as sun dipped below skyline, I stepped outside onto hangar porch. Evening sky painted with faint contrails, North Atlantic routes shifting like chalk lines redrawn by invisible hands. I breathed in cool air. Let silence wrap around me. I no longer needed applause or recognition. My purpose had become simpler, to teach others how to hold their own skies. No matter how turbulent,